Let's see. So let's get started. Today's going to be a little bit, just more informal. I think we're gonna kind of walk through the process that I use to tackle different APIs, and I'll kind of set this up with why you should be using APIs when at all possible. Um, how to kind of go about just learning different API techniques and API calls, and that's going to be a simple answer, which is using things like ChatGPT and other tools like that, like Google Gemini. But at the end of the day, what I've kind of learned, probably now making about 20 different types of API connections and webhooks through Clay, is that really you just have to find the kind of the schema of how the API works, and it's different. Every site has different parameters by which you can use the API, and then if you're not an expert at it, which by no means am I, then you kind of utilize the tools that are available to you to kind of figure it out. So that's going to be it. And I hope that you'll be able to take something away from this and, really start making some of the connections with APIs. But I want to start by, the premise of, why using APIs is important. So I'm going to come to Clay for a minute, and we're just going to go to looking at the plans that you see here on the screen. And the first thing I'll tell you is that a lot of what I do revolves around the ability to connect to Clay, whether it be pulling data into Clay, pushing data out of Clay. And, there are definitely ways to do things in Clay that are more cost effective. And by far, I think APIs is one of those ways, right? So if you use Clay on a regular basis, you'll know that on a free plan, you don't really have any kind of API access. If you get into the starter plan here, what's nice about that very specifically is that any of the enrichments that they have built in, so I'll just use Apollo for example, that can now be connected to via API. So anytime you add an enrichment to a table, which I'll show you in a second, then you can use your own API key. So that opens up to you at the 149 plan. And then if you jump to the 349 plan, this is where you can start to use webhooks, as you can see here, and then you can send your data anywhere you want via API. So I think those are kind of important jumping off points. For me, I can't see how it would ever be below this 349 plan, just because you will see it's so much more cost effective to use APIs for any of these integrations. And then plus there's just a lot of different data points that are available directly via API. So, and I'll start with, for example, yesterday, I created and shared a workflow around using Zapier. And Zapier is a great example where it opens up thousands, I think 7,000 is one number that I landed on yesterday, of different possibilities where, without being on this 349 plan, I could connect Clay to Zapier and then go and do whatever I wanted to. So just some economics there. Again, I know not everybody can necessarily afford to be here, and I get that, but if you start doing any kind of scale, then you're going to realize really quickly that calling APIs versus using Clay credits is exponentially more cost effective. So let me pause there for a minute. Any questions about that at all? I can't, just double check in the chat here. All right, so let's start with a few. I'm going to start with the one I mentioned yesterday, which is Zapier. So this is a very, very simple table. I wasn't trying to overcomplicate it by any means, but the idea was that could I send whatever I want from Clay to Zapier, right? So I'm going to go into Zapier and kind of show you how I did this, but this one's actually pretty straightforward because it uses a webhook. And so webhooks are pretty unique in the sense that they can capture data actions that occur as they happen. So I'm going to show you in this case how we send and we use Zapier to receive the webhook. And then in a minute, I'll do the reverse where we'll show you how to use Clay to capture data via webhook, right? So we'll show you kind of both options, right? But I think these are pretty straightforward use cases, but they're both, kind of uniquely impactful. So we'll start with Zapier first. If you go into Zapier, I'll kind of back up a little bit here and just show you from the start. If you noticed in Zapier, you now very specifically, you have this AI, tool that kind of asks you what you want to build. So I just typed in Webhook here, and their AI is going to give me some suggestions. Give it a second, and there it is, Webhook integration, right? So I'm just gonna choose that one here. Yes, it was helpful. Move some things out of the way here, and then we're gonna do try it. So this is kind of the sample that comes up from Zapier. It gives you a place to start. And I'll save you a little time. Like, I'm not going to go too in depth into the posting aspects. I'm just going to take this off for a second. And I'm really just going to focus on this one catch webhook here. And so anytime you see a webhook, basically you're going to be provided with URL. And that URL, which is that webhook, is what you're going to copy and paste into your other tool. So you're definitely using a webhook. In this case, you're using a webhook within Zapier to catch your data from Clay, right? So I have the URL that's right here, and then I'm going to come to Clay and move over here and give you an idea. This is already built, but I'm going to do it from scratch just to show you kind of how easy it is. And so we're going to back up here. We're going to create a new table, and then we're going to do a blank table. We'll just do custom table here. And obviously we get a couple of these default values, but I need now that API integration that I talked about within Clay. So if I go back here to Zapier, I can see right here, this is the URL I need. And so I'm going to add a column, and we're going to browse enrichments. And we're just going to say API. And then there is the Clay API key. So I need, and you'll kind of figure this out as you get used to API calls, but in this case, I need to post data from Clay into Zapier, right? So that's kind of the flow of how I'm going to do things. So I'm going to hit post. And then the next thing I need to do is I need the endpoint. So that endpoint where I'm sending my data is this webhook, right? So I'm going to copy this webhook here, and I'm going to paste it into here. So now I have kind of my method and then my endpoint. And that's pretty consistent. It doesn't matter what kind of API call you're doing. You're going to have a method by which you're going to do it, which can be post, get, put, other methods. And then you're going to have an endpoint, right? Now, we'll see probably in some of these other examples that we go through today. Like sometimes you're going to use body to really specify what you're going to send or receive. Other times you can do that dynamically in the endpoint. And the nice thing about this is you can actually inject data from your Clay table dynamically into endpoints or into the body, right? So we've talked about Cohere a lot in the past. There's been a lot of talk about Cohere and that API call within the WhatsApp group, because it gets a little bit complex whether or not you're appending the web search, et cetera. So, but both of those have all of those relevance, OpenRouter, they all start off with a method, and then they all start off with an endpoint, right? So that's very, very common. So the next thing in this case, we need to send the body, right? So what data do we want to send to Zapier, right? And so I'm just going to put a value in here so I can save this for a minute. I wish it was honestly as simple as just saying, let's just send this column, but it's not, but it's actually pretty easy. So we're going to save this just so I can get a little bit more data here. So I'm going to delete a few of these. And we're just going to rename this, and we'll just say, just so we know what it is, send to Zapier, right? So this is the column we're going to send to Zapier, right? So keep in mind, this could be the biggest Clay table you ever built. It could have 50 rows in it. And you could obviously also send multiple values as well, right? Not just one, but we're going to keep it simple today. And we're just going to say ABC. So just, further to build on this point, right? You could have a table like this, have all of this data, And then at the very end, you could do exactly what we're doing and send this email or this last name, etc. So just keep in mind, like you can append this enrichment, this API call to your existing tables as well. So there's my table down here. All right, so back to that, we have ABC, we have our API call, and now our only goal is to get it to this webhook integration, right? We want to push this column here. So I know how to do this, but I'm going to teach you how to do this the easy way, so you can kind of figure out how to do this going forward. But one of the easiest ways to do this is we're going to go here and we're going to go to ChatGPT. And we are going to tell it here, if I can move this menu out of the way. We're going to say, I want to send a column via API in the body of the API. The column name is, let's see, what did I name it? Send to Zapier. Structure this body format. Let's see if that gives us what we need. Sometimes you have to, play with it, right? Yeah, so way too complicated on the output. So we're going to try it again. Let's say I have a column called send to Zapier. Write the body of the API call. That probably should have been that simple the first time. So it's, for whatever reason, this is the drawback of doing it live, right? It's making this way too complicated. I don't know why it's asking me for all these fields. So again, this is real world. If you ever use ChatGPT, these are kind of things you run with. So I'm just gonna try it again with a new chat and see if I can get a better result, because I know I don't have all these fields. So let's just try a third time. I have a column called send to Zapier. Write me a simple API body. Let's see if that gets me what I need. No, it's not. So, hey, I don't know what to do, but I know how to do it. So I'm just gonna bypass the simple ChatGPT version and kind of come back to the table that I have. And here's the thing about doing it live. Let's see, maybe someone's gonna give me can you also use Make? I don't know, Nick. That's a great question. I have not tried this in Make, but from everything I know about Make, it accepts API calls, so I don't see any reason why. One of the things that probably will do that you ask that question is go figure it out. I know you can do it in Celonis, which is the parent tool of Make. Haven't tried it in Make itself. So, but Make and Say pretty much alike. They accept inbound API calls, so I see no reason why you couldn't. But I would say definitely go try it. I saw some post on my LinkedIn comment yesterday that said you could, so I definitely believe you can. So here you go. Look, I'm just going to show you the body. If you look back at, I don't know why GPT was overcomplicating this. It's giving me all these fields, but in the end of the day, I just need a column name in parentheses here, a semicolon, and then dynamically populate this field. And so it may have been just how I was asking it. Maybe it's having a bad day, but this is what I want, right? So I want to show you this. I'm going to cut and paste that. I'm going to go back to the table here, and we're going to input the body. Right. So here's a couple things, that to know about API calls, that especially with Clay, and it even says this, but we all tend to ignore the little things at the bottom that are in small letters. If you're dynamically populating a field, then you don't need to put it in these parentheses. But if you're just putting a value in there, you do. So I'm going to give you both examples, right? So if I just say Josh, we're going to send Josh to Zapier. Save that. Let's run it and see if it works. So it did work, and I know because I got a 200 value. I can see it was a success. Then going back to this API call here, you see that right here? Then I needed the parentheses, and I'm not dynamically populating it. I'm basically just telling it what to say. Now, if you're doing that, you really wouldn't be using it in Clay. So we want to dynamically populate it. So in other words, we want to populate it by this value here. So if you notice too, like I'm telling it what the name of the field is, but I could obviously change it to I want to change it to the name of the actual column, right? So let's do this here. We're just going to come back here. And now because we're not going to directly tell it what to say, we're going to populate it based off this value. We're just going to say send to Zapier and now save it. So every row I create from now on, whatever value that is, I'm going to send. So we're going to save and we're going to rerun it. Super fast, right? So if I come into the webhook here, it tells me we're listening. So let's see if it's really, really listening. And it is. So if you notice here, you can see there's the ABC. There's the Josh, right? So just like that, I mean, again, I know a little struggles there with GPT, but we were able to take our Clay data and push it, to Zapier, right? Pretty straightforward. I want to pause there because I know we got a little bit lost in the GPT not loving me today, but let me look at the questions here. Dominic says, yes, you can easily make a webhook or API call and make is the body form consistent across API calls. No, yeah. So Dominic asked a great question, and I've learned this too. The body form is definitely not consistent across API calls or specific to their API documentation. It is definitely specific to their API documentation, and as I was kind of mentioned earlier, and I'll kind of go back to this table. And maybe in a minute I can kind of show you one of these, but I did one with SERP API to pull Google Ads data. And it took me a while to read through the API documentation to figure it out because there was no body call. And then the other thing I did too was that you had to dynamically populate the endpoint, right? So they were driving everything through the endpoint. So same thing with the LinkedIn ads one I did. They were driving the search input through the endpoint, and there was no body call, right? So you definitely have to read the API documentation. But I'm gonna kind of help you with that too, because ChatGPT has kind of failed us so far today at some basic stuff. But there is one thing with the ChatGPT on your desktop that is 100% kind of game changing. So let me look and see, let me see if there's any other questions before I move on. And you can speak up, like you don't have to chat in if anybody wants to talk or has any questions before we get to the next one. All right, cool. So I want to show you how to receive data via webhook, because to me, this is probably one of the easiest things to do, and you don't have to really do much of this. So I'm going to use Instantly, for example, to do that. So let me get in there real quick. Let me log out and make sure I'm in my own accounts here. So I'm not showing you one of my clients' data. So let's see here. All my disconnects. It says deliverability is not a real issue. All right. So the thing about receiving data via webhook is you're going to want to go to the tool and identify where you can get specifically where you can get the webhook from, right? So, and Instantly, which I use, I also manage some clients in Smartly, pretty easy in both. But you can, even in Slack, right? You can send messages to Slack, via webhook, etc. Sometimes they make it really easy for you. Instantly makes it really easy. You just click the webhook button and you hit add a webhook, right? So we'll go there in just a second, but let's go to Clay. And let's create a new table. And this time we are going to import via Webhook, right? So I just need to find out where it is on the screen. There it is, import data via Webhook. We'll do a blank table. And right when you do that in Clay, they're going to give you the Webhook URL. So I'm going to copy that. And then I'm going to come to instantly. I'm going to say add webhook. And then I am going to paste that in here. And then under event type, I'm going to choose what I want. So with instantly, let's just say I wanted to get every time a lead is marked as interested. And then we're going to do target campaign. I'll just do all campaigns. And it's really that simple. So now the webhook has been added, right? And you can obviously change the parameters by which you want to do that. And so it should not pull in any data because it's going to start from now on anytime a reply is interested. But let's just go to one of mine and change it to interested. And let's see what happens. And just like that, boom, I have the data, right? So that's how powerful webhooks are, because if you think about it in the perspective of, you know, in the first example, Zapier is just listening to your Clay table, right? So anytime you were to add a new row to that Clay table, it would populate that, whatever you did from then forth with Zapier. This is the reverse, right? So imagine monitoring your instantly or smart lead campaigns, and you within a Clay table, anywhere that can receive a webhook or an API call. So it could be your CRM, doesn't matter. That's how easy it really is to kind of decipher and drill down into getting that data. And then this webhook has a ton of data in it, right? So if you look at all this data that's embedded in the webhook, here is, you know, the email, the campaign, the company name, the status, the did lead interested, their email, et cetera, timestamps, right? So I could obviously just add all these as columns real quickly in Clay. And, you know, if you wanted to, you know, here's how you could play that out. If we connect the first workflow to the second workflow, I could then, like this, talk about a real specific use case, right? I could monitor all my interested replies, have them come in as they happen, and then set this table up, build it out to whatever I want it to do, and then do exactly what we just did a few minutes ago, which is add the API webhook into Zapier. And then from Zapier, right, I could take this automation and connect it to 7,000 other things that are in Zapier, like, you know, whatever, send it to your CRM, you know, send it to an Excel, a Google Sheet, whatever you want to do, right? So that's kind of, if you want to talk about just kind of creating a level of automation relatively quickly, right? Monitor your email replies, webhook into a Clay table, or I guess in theory you could just webhook directly into Zapier and then do whatever you want, right? And so that's some of the automations that we do to just kind of cut down on time. But maybe you want to monitor, you know, bounces. Maybe you want to monitor any component of that, and you can do that with the webhooks. And then from there, it's really just you're limited to your imagination as far as where you want to go with that data. All right, so that's the second use case. Before I move on, let me just check and see any questions from anybody.
Yeah, I have a question. So, can you, let's say you have an existing Clay table and you want to monitor webhooks for like replies to that Clay table or something specific coming from instantly, right? Is there a way, like, how do you do that cross-reference where you're it's looking for the email within the email or whatever the identifying characteristic is to then go figure out whatever the data is that you need to pull from instantly. Just want to try to understand that because seems like this is just bringing in all interested replies into a table, right?
Yeah, and I think the scenario you're talking about, Dominic, which I've used before too, is imagine that I did all my lead gen in Clay and I loaded it to instantly because that's what we do. And then now I get a reply from somebody and I want to reference that previous table. Would that be a good example of what you're talking about? That has all
Yeah,
that lead
exactly. You're
data, but it's
looking for
not
like
necessarily,
reporting data. Yeah.
yeah, that's not in my webhook, right? So the easiest way to do that is just to add an enrichment to look up to table. So you can go, and so I just typed in look in the add enrichment. And so you can look for multiple rows in one table or look up for a single row in another table. the only thing you're going to need to know is what table that's in, right? So I would, if you're going to build out something where you know that you need this data, right? Then you're going to want to be intentional about how you structure your naming of your tables in Clay. But you can do a single lookup or a multiple row lookup. And so in this case, we'll just do single, and then you tell it the table to search. So obviously I've got, tons of tables, but I'll just pick one. And then from there, you tell it the target column that you're looking for. So maybe I'm looking for their first name, and then you can do equals or contains. So 2 different types of searches. And then you cross-reference it to whatever row value you have in your table. So in this case, I would be doing first name to first name, and it's going to run, and it will give you, whether it has one result or multiple results, it will give you that result. And then you can just add that column as a table in this existing table, right? So I do it all the time where I'm cross-referencing.
So if I can just paraphrase, you would have a large kind of holding table that you might have for opens, or you might have for replies, and then you're just basically in your other table, you're querying that Clay table that's been created from the API or from the webhook that you ran from Instantly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one way to do it. Yeah,
great.
Or you could even do it where, like, I'll show you in mine. So I have tables that are, huge. Like some of my lead generation tables, I don't know if this is one of them, but I have some that are like 20, 30,000 rows. And so if I get those, this is definitely a big table. It's taking a long to load. But if I get results on that coming back, so this one has 9,200. This is all lead data, Dominic, right? So what I would do if I was monitoring my replies and Instantly with that table that we just built, I would have it cross-reference this table to pull back all this data about this lead that I already have before I did anything else, right? Because I've already spent all the money to get all this lead data. So I don't want to redo that. So if this lead were to respond to one of my emails, I would just do a lookup to the email address from my current table to this table. And then I'd be able to pull every one of these columns in if I wanted to that webhook table.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So Nabil, you answered your own question. Cool. All right. All right, let's go on. So I think we're probably somewhere around halfway. So I think I want to do a little bit more complicated, and just show you kind of the iterative process I go through. Again, it's never perfect. I've spent sometimes an hour and a half on figuring out webhooks, and webhooks I think are pretty straightforward. It's just copy and paste in the URL more than anything, but it gets a little bit complex when you do some of the complicated tables. All right, so let's come in here and let's see. I have a demo table here, and let's just do relevance is a great example of one that's pretty complicated. So, but we talked a lot about relevance, right? So I think it's a good one. So this one is specific to agent. So one of the things I learned with relevance, if you're calling a tool, and I'm kind of leaning on the previous knowledge we discussed. If you're calling a tool, it's pretty straightforward because the tool has its own API, and you can just make a call to that API and get the result. With tools like SendSpark, we use that for outbound video, on lead gen for relevance. They make multiple calls, right? So the first call is to actually trigger the agent, and then the second call is to get the agent result. And so if you look at this table right here within relevance, there's one post API call to actually trigger the agent, and actually it's called agent trigger. And then the other one is actually a retrieve, and that one is to get the response, right? So this is a great example, and we could probably spend an hour talking about how to rebuild this because it's somewhat complicated. But I want to show you some parameters that are different between these two, and why it's important to kind of study the API documentation, because this one took me a little while to figure out. So the first one on relevance, if we come in here and you notice a couple things here, right? So we have a dedicated endpoint There's nothing dynamic happening at this endpoint, right? We have a post, so we're posting our information from Clay into Relevance. And then if you remember kind of the general structure of the one we did with Zapier, right, is we have columns. So we have message, role, content, and agent ID. And then again, we have an input, right? So here's the input column, blank at the moment, but it's dynamic, right? It will take whatever's in this column. So in this case, and this is very similar to, like, you see a lot of commonalities in different API calls, but if you've seen the Cohere one, it has a message column, right? So there is some similarity in different structures, but obviously there's no agent ID in Cohere, right? This agent ID is limited and specific to the agent that we're calling in Relevance, right? So you figure all that out by looking at the API documentation, which I'll pull up in a minute within Relevance. But you get an idea of what structure you have to have in the body, and then you get an idea, obviously, of what your endpoint is. So let me pull up Relevance for a minute, and I'll just kind of show you some of that. And I'll show you a few tricks here that I learned playing and getting familiar with Relevance. I was proud of myself. It took a little while to figure this one out because it's kind of two-tiered. And then you'll see in a second that when you create the second API query, you have to dynamically populate the URL. So I think I did it on, let's see, I think it's this one. We'll see. So we're going to come in and we're going to edit it so we can look at some of the data here. And then here's the API, right? So I'm in Relevance. This is one of the tools that we're running like 7 or 8 different things on. We go to API and we're going to see we have an endpoint, right? So here's the endpoint. It's a post. So right away, if we come back to the table here, we can see here's the endpoint. We know it's a post, right? So Relevance is making that part pretty easy. You then have to generate your own API key. And so that's going to be very, very common in API calls, that you need an API key, and that API key is going to come from that platform, right? It does get a little bit more complex in some cases where they'll ask for like a token and, you know, different levels of authorization that are a little bit more complex, but generally it's, you need an API key. And then in some instances, you're going to put that API key in the body. I've seen the API key end up in the URL. And then in a lot of cases as well, you're going to put the API key in the aspect, and I'll show you down here, in the headers, right? So you see this almost in every workflow that we share, where you have an API key. Oftentimes you'll have like the words bearer and then the API key. With Relevance, you don't need to put the word bearer, but the structure is pretty similar, right? Content type, application JSON, authorization, and then the API key. Most of them have these headers, right? And have these headers as part of the requirements. But, you know, you have to kind of play around to kind of figure that out of whether it's required and look at the documentation. So let's go back to Relevance here, and we can see here's the information. It gives us, you know, I can complicate this by telling you there's multiple ways to write these API calls. You know, you can use Python, you can use a lot of different ways to do it. They're just different languages that are ultimately giving you the ability to write your API call differently. But what I will generally do is look to see if they have a sample request body, which here in this case, they do, right? So you can see pretty straightforward. We have the sample body. And if you were to go to my call here, it's structured the exact same way. The only thing I changed, right, is so I literally copied this, I pasted it. It's really nice when they have it in this format. And I pasted it here. And then I just said, from a content perspective, I want to dynamically drop in this input. Okay. So again, not easy, but Relevance is kind of making it easier for us because they're telling us, it's a post, here's your endpoint, here's your request body. Unfortunately, not everybody makes it this easy. But in this case, you know, they made it a little bit easier because they've given us a lot of the API work that we need to do, right? And so there you go. But if you want to dive in even more so, what I often will do is I'm going to cancel out of here for a minute, and I'm going to go into the help menu, the answer to all the world's problems, right? So we go to documentation, and we're going to look for APIs. And here it is, conversation API for agents, right? So it's going to kind of walk you through everything you need, including generating your API key, which is a little bit of a process with Relevance. And then you kind of start to read through this and you understand, like, what do I need, right? So I'm always going to need an agent ID to make the second call, to trigger an event, what I need to do. Now with Relevance, you can actually have it, like, because it's an agent, you can have conversations. So there's different ways to structure your API call to basically like send it a response, wait for that response, almost like a conversation. So it can get a lot more complex. But I'm going to show you one of the things that I do with documentation like this that helps a lot. Is, so let's pick a part that I don't understand, right? Let's just say I don't understand what this means, right? Like, for a lot of people, this could be completely foreign, right? So back to kind of GPT, I'm going to pull up my GPT desktop here. And of course, there's a new version to launch, but we are going to go, hopefully you can see this, but I'm going to move this out of the way. And I'm going to click here and I'm going to say, take a screenshot. And I am on this page right here. And it's going to do that for me. And I'm going to say, explain
We
what
can't see your
this
screen share, Josh.
Oh, you can't? Okay, thanks for telling me. Hopefully. Let's figure it out here. How about now?
You're good now.
Okay. So what this is, I don't know if you can see the top of my screen, but I have the ChatGPT desktop app installed. And so I open that up. And one of the nice things about that is if you scroll here at the bottom where the little paperclip is, and now it's not working. Move this out of the way, see if that makes a difference. Yeah. So if you click the little paper clip, you can take a screenshot. And I actually took a screenshot of this window that I had open with Relevance. And so it took it right there, and I'm gonna say, you know, I don't know anything about API calls. What does this mean in plain English? And so it's going to look at the information that's on that screen, and it's going to really help kind of explaining it to you. So this, I will tell you, like, you know, even before the desktop version of ChatGPT, I would just take a screenshot and then upload it to ChatGPT. Now I can do it dynamically, but this will help you a lot, just breaking down what kind of information you need to get that API call set up, right? So this is telling you, like, for authorization, you need 3 pieces of information: the project ID, the token, and your region. Finding the agent ID, here's where you go to find the ID to start a conversation with the agent. And that, again, is only, move this out of the way, stop sharing, reshare. That is only this information right here, right? So that explanation that I asked it for was specifically about this, right? So this is the process, just so you know, that I went through to figure out, okay, there's 2 steps in this calling an agent in Relevance, right? The first step is sending the data to the agent. And then the second step is getting the data as a result of the agent. So here's that. Let me pull up. I label it retrieve. So post, send, retrieve, get. And as you can see, now I'm getting versus posting. So I'm getting that information. The screenshot we just went over in ChatGPT, what it tells us is that we need the studio ID. So we have a URL, we need the studio ID and then the job ID. And it actually shows that. So let's see here, right here in this explanation. And this, what ChatGPT is, it helped me figure out where to get that information. And from there, if you notice what's a little bit different about this, there's no body call, right? So the message is what the message is at this point, because I told it in the post what to do. So all I'm doing now is retrieving this information, right? And so part of that is I'm just going to this one endpoint via API and getting this information. So this one's pretty complex, and I know it's probably a little bit confusing. And if I had, more time, I could just slow it down and take it step by step. But I thought this is a really good one to understand because it's complicated, right? And the way to demystify the complicated, right, is just find tools that help you do it. Relevance is pretty good, specifically in their documentation, but it's still complex, right? It's different code, et cetera. The way I have found to work around that really is, today I use the ChatGPT desktop. I just take screenshots of it and have it explain it to me. But in other scenarios, I'll take before the desktop, or if you don't have that, just take a screenshot, upload it to ChatGPT and tell it to explain to you what it means. But this one, if you run it, it will get the information that you send to it. It'll retrieve that. And if you remember from our previous discussions, and this is kind of a good example, this agent right here that we were looking at, it does take a little while, right? It takes about a minute to run because it's running all these different steps in there, right? But very, very possible to have a clay table, and it actually works in reverse as well, or have an agent, have that agent go out and do things that maybe you don't have accessibility to do in clay, and then pull that information back in clay using this exact table, right? And it's just this, what you do is you set it up to run, it goes out and gets the information, and then this will retrieve it, and then you have whatever answer or whatever output that you're looking for. So let me check and see what other questions. Does this work on the tool level as well? Yeah, so honestly, the tools are much easier. Let me show that for a minute here. If you go to the tools, and we'll just pick this one I have up at the moment. And so on any of these use option here, there's an API call right here, and same kind of approach we talked about before, where it gives you the body of it. So that's nice. You don't have to figure out like all the columns and everything. And then here's the endpoint, right? And you can post directly to the tool, and it'll give you back the response. Versus with the agent, because it's taking multiple different steps, you have to wait for the agent to complete. Whereas with the tool, it's going to execute, and even though some of the tools do have multiple stacks, it's just one retrieval call. So at least from my experience, much easier from a tool perspective. Yeah. So one of the questions Dominic has, could you go as far as uploading the API docs for the two platforms you're trying to get to work together, and tell GPT for Omni what you're trying to do? Yeah, I mean, I would go as far as saying I've definitely done that. Like I've spent lots of time trying to demystify API calls with GPT-4 and telling it. I think the trick with GPT-4 when it comes to a lot of different things is to have it assume a persona. So I will tell it, like, assume you are a expert coder and your job is to help me build APIs. That'll be my first thing I write. And then I'll say, okay, here are, and especially now with GPT-4 Omni and with the ability to upload docs, like I'll even, copy API documentation to 2 or 3 pages in a Google Doc or a Word doc, and then I'll upload that, or a PDF, and say, okay, review this documentation. And it'll say, okay, I did. And then I'll upload the second one, review this documentation. Okay. And then this is what I am trying to do, and spit that out. It's pretty good. Like, it's never going to be perfect, I think, but the complexity of reasoning and the ability to kind of figure out some of these complex things, I think it will help you tremendously. And most of the time, it'll get me all the way to where I'm trying to go. All right, so let's move on. So that's relevance, right? And that's pretty, it's a pretty complex one on the high end. The last one I want to do is OpenRouter, just because I think it's less complex and pretty easy to work with. So we come into OpenRouter again, just another tool. Let's see, where you can, kind of figure out everything you need to do. Is, I love OpenRouter just because you can call, any different large language model. And again, the concept is very similar. Let me see if I can pull up a table that has OpenRouter in it. So many different ones. That's amplified to OpenRouter. This one does. All right, so then this is, I want to stretch your imagination a little bit, because this one, really the goal here with this one was just, I put this out an hour after they released GPT-4 Omni, before it wasn't even built into Clay. But the idea here with this one is you can get creative in your dynamic prompting if you can do API calls, because I never really went into a lot of detail with this when I shared these tables, but part of the reason why I like the idea of using OpenRouter to make an API call is because I could dynamically prompt it with a list that was static, right? So if you go into this, you see how I've created all these different options in these tables, right? These are all the models. They're not all the models. There's a lot more in OpenRouter than this, but I went into Clay and I just made a list, right? And I could even color code them or whatever I wanted to do to make it pretty. But it's actually a drop down, right? So you can choose, and you can choose which value you want, right? But it's almost like a CRM to some extent, or almost like a SaaS, because you can dynamically populate it, and then because of that, this value is going to feed to OpenRouter, right? So let's get into OpenRouter. Let's look. Again, this is a post. We're sending data from the Clay table to OpenRouter, and then we have an endpoint. So this endpoint's pretty standard for OpenRouter. It's their chat endpoint, and it's the completion endpoint from whatever you're sending it. And then this API call, if you notice, it actually has multiple dynamic inputs. So this one, again, the structure of this one's pretty similar to things like Cohere. A little trick here is that a lot of these have a max tokens option, and I use that in Cohere, and I use that in this call, because with max tokens, this is the max input tokens. I did the calculations. Again, it's not exact, but around 4,000 is the match to the output that will not exceed the limit of the Clay table. So essentially what that means is I don't want an output that comes back that limits the amount of characters that Clay row and Clay column can hold, because then it's going to error out. So that's part of the reason. I didn't actually come up with this, Brandon Charleston did, but works really, really well. He came up with that theory, and then I just started testing which values work. So 4,000 works for me. And you can put this in multiple, works for Cohere, again, works for OpenRouter. But a couple things here you'll notice, I'm dynamically injecting the model. So again, this is just these values that are right here, and we're putting that here. We have tokens, and then this is the prompt, and then the structure of the body that I got directly from OpenRouter. So again, if you were to come into OpenRouter and you were to look at the framework, and it took me a little while to figure out what the structure of this framework was, but ultimately I just read through this documentation. I did a little chat GPT, and I said, okay, what is the API call that I need to make to actually get the values that I want? But there's a lot more in here, right? So you can go further in here and do things like parameters, dynamic parameters. You can do limits as well. You can have it call only a default model, etc. But one of the things I want you to notice is that you see for every one of these, they have different URLs that you can call. So part of this, again, is just figuring that out with OpenRouter and what you're trying to complete. And if this this becomes too complex for you, right? Just utilizing GPT to help you interpret what you're trying to figure out. But at the end of the day, with OpenRouter, if you get in there, we are able to dynamically populate our model, and then our prompt is whatever we want it to be, right? So almost in every single table I built, and I use APIs, especially Cohere. I use it thousands of times a day. I always set up a prompt column, right? And that prompt is what allows us to dynamically tell, at least in this case, OpenRouter, what we want it to do, right? So if I scroll a little bit further down, you'll notice the very similar structure to what we saw in the other API calls, which is a content type, application JSON, authorization. In this case, and I think this is more common than not, you see bearer and then the API key. So very, very common. The other one we looked at did not require the word bearer, but that is just, and there may be a technical reason for that, I don't even know. But again, one of the things I will do often when I'm not sure, I know generally speaking, when I'm looking at bodies, that there's going to be a column that I want, like model, max tokens, messages. These are pretty structured in the API documentation. And then with that is going to be a value that I'm sending it, right? So if you kind of understand that general premise, then you can often take previous API calls you've done too and copy and paste and kind of just modify the fields to match what you want. But the last thing I think I'll go into is just remembering that, you know, when you're running these running the APIs, some of them are pretty huge. So I'm going to give you my most robust, extreme example of API calling, which is CoreSignal. So CoreSignal, we'll just kind of end it with this. CoreSignal is a very robust API, but it's not complicated, right? We do a post call. Here's the endpoint. And in this case, when you're using CoreSignal, you go in, you type in the search query you want, and they will actually give you the endpoint with the result. And so it tells you what the endpoint is. There's no body and same structure, application, you know, a little bit accept, then authorization, and then there's a bearer API code, right? But this one, this is kind of a good example of almost similar to the question you asked, Dominic, where I did a write to table on the query because I needed that output of this first query to get the result, right? So it's aired out, so it's kind of hard to show you. But what happens when you run this API key is it gives you like a code, and it's like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I need that code, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in the second query to get the results, right? So it's very similar to Relevance. It's one query to tell it what to get, second query to return it. But it was well worth it. I'll show you why here in a second. So you look at CoreSignal results. So in this second API call that we make, there's that ID number I was talking about. So I send that ID to the second table, and then I needed that ID number to call the second endpoint. And this one's kind of nice because again, there's no body work on this one. It's just send the call, get an ID number, take the ID number, add it to the second endpoint, and same structure, application JSON. But the data on this is just ridiculous that you get back, right? So we get just field after field of data. And this is not a cheap data source, but it's well worth it if in the right use cases. But they have nested lookalike companies, all of their social media updates, all kinds of employee data, LinkedIn data, just etc. So it's just ridiculous. Funding data, Crunchbase data, you know, employees that are featured. It just goes on and on and on, right? So just a ton of data. So definitely not cheap, but it came back with significant results. And again, you can only get this data via API call. And you can kind of see what I did with it. Like I summarized the funding, I summarized company recent news, I looked at similar companies, and it's robust, right? The amount of data that we're pulling in. So this would be great for like a small hyper-personalized lead campaign where you're willing to spend maybe $1 or $2 per lead on this type of research because it's robust and super powerful research. but you can only get to it via API call. So it was worth it for me to figure out, like, I needed 2 tables, one to post, one to retrieve, but the result is so much data for little work going forward now that I know how to do it. So I will wrap up by saying, like, again, there's a lot of hesitancy I see from people to move to like a 349 plan on Clay, but this is why you do it, right? I think I've showed in previous sessions, like we call tools like ICPs, where you can validate emails, zero bounce, different API tools to get Google Ads, LinkedIn ads, different CRMs. Like the use cases just go on and on and on. So to me, there's no reason why, unless you're just not sending an offer that has the potential to return, anything more than $350 a month. Like if you're doing lead generation in any capacity or form, or doing any kind of copy, or like, you just can't expect tools like Clay to add 7,000 enrichments, right? They're going to, and we're just talking about Clay for now, but Relevance, Clay, Zapier, et cetera, it's all about connecting them to each other. And then the power of those tools just go up, tenfold, right? So APIs is the way to do it. You don't have to be a programmer to learn it. You just have to kind of figure out some of the basics like we talked about today, and then use tools like GPT, or even more importantly, I think Google Gemini is super powerful on this to help you figure out how to make the call. Because once you figure out how to make the call and dynamically populate that data, it just changes your skill set across the board. So I'll kind of end there. Let me see if there's any further questions. We got a couple minutes. So anybody have any questions they want to ask out loud?
Yeah. Can I ask for one specific use case that we were thinking of within our agency, but I'm not smart enough when it comes to the API stuff yet. With Omni, now that we can have documents, we were thinking about creating a specific chain. And for example, if a client has a document full of case studies and we want to match the case study to each specific lead that we're sending it to, we could do a call to a specific thread in ChatGPT. Is it possible to get data from one specific thread, or does it only use the LLM as a whole?
You should be able to. Probably the best way to go about doing that would be through like a custom GPT, and then like a tool that you build in Relevance. But it'd really depend on how you structure that data. But I think if you can call that case study, then I don't see a reason why you couldn't do it.
Interesting. All right, thanks.
Yeah, I'm all about trial and error. Like, give me a use case and we see if we can figure it out. But even if you think about like just where you host and where you put that information, like it all comes down to, can we get whatever we're trying to call as our source of information in a place that we can then call via API or webhook? Because then after that, then you can pretty much do whatever you want with Clay or these other tools, right? But it's all about where your starting point is. But I definitely think it's possible.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Of course, Colin. All right. Well, we are 1 minute before the hour, so hopefully we got a little value on this. I'll have Len share the recording a little bit later today, and we will see everybody on Tuesday. Appreciate everybody's time.